Ramsey case. So they asked me to take the lead chief investigator's position as well as the lead role in this case. So I go into some detail about that transition in the book and some of my opening remarks. I left there in the spring of 2006 when Jay Harrington was recruiting me back to the marshal's office here. They'd gone through two interim chiefs, two sergeants that worked for me, had served in that capacity. Then they hired an Aurora lieutenant who came in and served for a little more than a year, and then she decided she too was going to retire. And so they started recruiting me back, and we came to an arrangement, and I was happy to be back. I missed the mountains. And so I've been back in Telluride as the chief marshal ever since. With regard to my writing experiences, a friend of mine who I sent this book to, a high school friend I grew up with in Michigan, reminded me that my first published piece was a murder mystery that I wrote in high school about in Detroit. I wrote about the mafia, which had a very high profile in some regards there. At one point, Detroit was Murder City. It's since been eclipsed by other communities, but he still has that manuscript. I don't know where mine is, but those were the days before you had photocopying machines. And so the friend of mine, his mother, actually took my handwritten manuscript and had someone in the office type it up on carbon paper. And the most she could get out of the carbon copy paper was about 6 or 7 copies. So it's a very rare manuscript if you're interested. I can't find mine. I'm almost too embarrassed to ask him to scan it and send it to me. But that was my first writing experience. But over the years, as I attended the writing conferences here, I continued to do more writing. In Boulder, I started a murder mystery novel that went through about 4 transitions of computers. Every new computer wouldn't take the disk or floppies from the other one, so I kept losing material. I had about 250 pages. The story grew stale, and I just kind of dumped it, and then decided to work on something else. It was not my intention to really come out and write a book about the JonBenet Ramsey case. I always had thought that there would be a successful prosecution in this. And it wasn't until after I left the DA's office in 2006 and was hoping for a change in leadership at the DA's office that I thought a prosecution might be obtained. It's a very complicated legal landscape, and following the arrest of John Mark Carr, late in the summer after I'd left the DA's office, I decided to try to pursue a grand jury, get the governor involved and try to get some of the former prosecutors that had been involved in the grand jury investigation back in 1998 to review new things that I had discovered when I was working as the lead investigator in the case. Now that met with a lot of frustration and no success, and I spell a little bit out of that process in my book about trying to move the case forward for prosecution. But I never envisioned writing a piece if I thought that was still going to be the case. And when I finally realized that there's not going to be any successful prosecution brought, I thought it was important to try to go out and reveal things that were never known to the public, that had been either withheld or new information that was out there that was only known to a few law enforcement folks, and share what I thought was a bigger truth, a larger truth about the course of the investigation and new things that had been discovered. The 16th anniversary of JonBenet's murder will be this December. There's a lot of details that people probably have forgotten about. And so when I get into some of the investigative pieces here, I'll share some of those things to help refresh your memory if you don't remember some of them. I'm not going to give it away. I'm not going to ruin the end of the book. And I'll tell you that I wrote this so that you could evaluate the evidence on your own and make your own conclusion, draw your own thoughts and beliefs from what I presented as objectively as I could, I hope. So that's the information that I've received back from people. And that's going to be our purpose here tonight. This is the face of the book. You've seen this before. It says, a former lead investigator breaks 6 years of silence. I tried to get the DA's office in January of 2006 to pursue leads that I thought were worth going after, as well as trying to get another grand jury to pursue some things that we might not be easily able to obtain. So that was part of the title. Initially, I had called this Foreign Faction, and that was part of the byline, a former lead investigator breaks 6 years of silence. My editor, who is here in the audience with us tonight, Regan Tuttle, was referred to me by Bob Rubidoux, who was one of the individuals I met in the writing classes earlier. And a year or two ago, he started a project here on self-publishing, which I attended most of those sessions, and kind of it planted a seed with me about how to possibly proceed. And she suggested the part, Who Really Kidnapped JonBenet, so that you could link that connection with this investigation. And I thought it had a nice ring to it, so I adopted that in the title. This took me 3 years to write. I didn't start the endeavor until the spring of 2009. And if you remember the sequence, Lacey left office at the end of 2008 after exonerating the family based on some touch DNA. And then Stan Garnett came in and took the DA's office helm. He turned the investigation back over to Boulder authorities. The first thing that Mark Beckner did as chief was to gather a group of experts in a variety of fields and take a look at the case. They hadn't had it for 8 years, and see where the investigation stood at that time, and then get some suggestions as to where the course could possibly go to help bring resolution to this murder. So I was asked to present information that I had uncovered and discovered during my part in the investigation. And during a cold case task force meeting that had about 30 people involved, I gave a 2-hour presentation. When I left in May, about 3 months later, I started sitting down and writing something that I thought would be a historical piece to show how the case had been solved. It's still unsolved, although I think when you get done reading this, you might have a better idea of who was involved, whether it was an intruder or family. And so I wrote almost every weekend, sometimes on nights. It was almost a full-time job as I started to compile this over a 3-year period of time. Regan got involved in editing for me, I think, in the fall of last year, as I was still doing some writing. She agreed to look at it without telling anybody about this project, so I didn't want to get compromised. And it was fun to hear from her, because I'd give her some printed chapters, and she'd go through looking for grammatical errors and other things, and suggesting some other phraseology. And then she would say, "Man, I couldn't put this down, but I got to go grade some papers." So it was kind of fun to hear that input from her right from the beginning as we started to go through this process. The year my son graduated from CSU, my wife and I took he and his girlfriend to Mexico for a vacation in Mexico. I can't remember where we went, to Cancun or something. And I took my laptop with me and wrote a couple of chapters while I was there on vacation, sitting around the pool. So that's kind of the attitude I had about trying to get this completed. Initially, I thought it might be a couple hundred, 200, 300 pages. When all was said and done, it turned over 500 pages, which really floored me when I heard that from my interior designer. There were times when I would hike up to the back of the property at my place. Sometimes I'd snowshoe up there in the wintertime and sit up there and look out on this scenery as I was typing away on the laptop, and every once in a while, deer or elk or a coyote would wander by. And it was sometimes a little distracting to try to write when you had this type of scenery. I mean, we live in a beautiful area. And so that was kind of the train of thought there. This is just a picture I took this last few weeks with some of the colors that were going on. So despite the difficulty in concentrating sometimes, I was able to get this completed. As far as the investigative process goes, I spell out a little bit more in one of the chapters about how I viewed my role in this investigation. Despite the fact that I had been with Boulder 17 years, I felt it was my responsibility and obligation to look at this evidence objectively and try to form my own opinion and not decide what other people had already concluded. And so I felt like I needed to look at the core documents, the initial police reports, the initial witness statements, the family statements, some of the other physical evidence that had been documented, forensic examination of things, those types of reports and videos and photographs I thought I needed to become familiar with. Despite it being a cold case, the DA's office was getting almost daily correspondence from people. People would call and leave voicemail messages, they would write, they would email. And I felt that in order to properly evaluate information coming into the office, I really needed to know what the investigation was about. Most of the primary investigators that worked the case initially, in the early years I'd worked with before during my time in Boulder. I'd been gone for 3 years before the murder took place in 1996, but I still spoke to those guys. Some of them came up and worked as reserves here for us in Telluride when this case was being actively investigated. So I was looking at the examination of theories of the crime. There were two probably distinct theories out there. One was that a sexual predator had broken in to the home and had targeted JonBenet, and then other folks believed someone in the family was involved, and the primary theory was that Patsy had been involved in the death of her daughter. So I set about trying to do an objective review of the case. When I decided to write about this, I was looking at the process by which I gathered information. I was trying to decide the format in which I would tell this story. And I went through a variety of different thought processes trying to determine how I would tell about how I'd explain my my role in this investigation as a criminal investigator. And I ended up dividing it into 4 parts. Because the case was so old, I felt like it was necessary to give a historical perspective of the investigation. And so the first part of the book, I try to spell out objectively as I could the course of the investigation that officers and detectives were involved in when they first responded on the day of the reported kidnapping, the follow-ups they did, the interviews they did, the examination of the physical evidence, the analysis of that, the autopsy, the different opinions that they obtained from forensic medical people about JonBenet's injuries, so that you could have an objective, clear viewpoint of what the factual parts of the case were. There had been so many different misrepresentations in the media about this or that I felt I needed to try to paint a clear picture based on my review of all the documents that would give you a first-hand account of what the situation was with regard to the death. It's funny how things turn out. I never expected that one day I'd be going to Boulder and to the DA's office and being asked to become the lead investigator in this case. I mentioned, I'll do one very other additional short reading. I mentioned that I was asked to present at the 2009 Cold Case Task Force meeting when Boulder PD took the case back from the DA's office. This invitation to present information that I had put together, a lot of which I'd presented to Mary Lacey's office before I left, was something that I'd been waiting for quite some time. It was a meeting that was to take place over the course of 2 days. And I drove to Boulder, spent the night there, a couple nights there by myself. I was not sleeping very well. I was very nervous, very emotionally charged, wanting to give the best presentation I could. I took what was roughly about an 8-hour presentation that I had given to the DA's office in January 2006 and boiled it down to about a 2-hour presentation. Tried to synopsize as many of the key elements of things that I thought were important as I could. And so after this 2-day roundtable, I'm headed back to Telluride. And I'll just pick up a couple pages here from there. I was exhausted from a week of anxious, irregular sleep patterns, and 2 days spent reviewing the details of the investigation had been mentally and physically draining. Boulder was more than 4 hours behind me as I headed home to the mountains of southwestern Colorado. The Escalante Canyon was coming up on the approach to Delta, and the decision was made to pull off the highway to do some meditative wandering. The Escalante was a frequent stopping point for me on my return trips from the Front Range, and meandering over the open, rugged plain offered a brief respite of quiet and solitude. Moreover, it offered the opportunity to explore something that had been tugging at the edge of my consciousness for some period of time. Something said during our review of the investigation had set my subconscious into overdrive. It had been there, just hiding beneath the surface since the early days of my involvement in the investigation, and I felt that a meditative hike through the backcountry might help flush out the intangible that had been lingering in the background for several years. I contemplated the comment that had stirred my memories. A Colorado Bureau of Investigation lab supervisor had talked about looking at the chronological sequence of events. I knew there was a challenge in that because from the early outset of their response to the 911 call reporting the kidnapping of JonBenet, Boulder police had decided to maintain radio silence so as not to alert the perpetrators to their activities. Constructing an accurate time clock from the dispatch radio logs for a number of the investigative steps that were taken on December 26, 1996 could be challenging. Nevertheless, the comment about establishing a timeline for the sequence of events struck a chord for me. After having pored over hundreds of pages of police reports, interviews, and lab findings during my time as a lead investigator in the case, I recognized that it was in the nature of the sequence of events that had been hovering in the shadows of my subconscious for the previous 3.5 years. The missing piece gradually began to take form as I trekked in a westerly direction toward the canyon walls enveloping the Gunnison River. It occurred to me that the answer had been voiced during my presentation regarding analysis of John Ramsey's statements. I'd held up 2 photographs for the group to see, one of John Mark Carr and the other a psychic rendition of what a perpetrator was supposed to look like. And these are the pictures I showed. Dorothy Allison presented this on a television show at one juncture, which was posted on the Ramsey's website. This is a picture of John Mark Carr when authorities went to Thailand to bring him back after he had email correspondence. And I'll send these around. I think they're eerily similar to one another. So I don't know if the psychic was on Mark or what, but I showed these to the group that had gathered there for the Cold Case Task Force meeting. Holding the photos up for all to see, I had posed a rhetorical question to the group. Where were they hiding? There had been an inordinately long pause of silence after I asked the question, and some forgotten insight had momentarily surfaced but was gone before I could fully take hold of it. The synapses had failed to fire, and it wasn't until I was hiking in the solitude of the rugged plain that the full image finally came to mind. As the sun breaks the horizon during its rise, so did the thought slowly emerge that shed clarity on the shadow that had been plaguing me. The realization slowly dawned that, according to John Ramsey's account, at least one of the intruders must have remained hiding in the home well after the time that police arrived on the scene to investigate the kidnapping of his daughter. That brought me to a halt, and I struggled to recall the sequence of people's visits to the basement that morning, which is where intruder theorists indicated the suspect or suspects had entered the home. There were 4 people who had been through the basement that morning, included 2 police officers, Fleet White and John Ramsey. The condition of that train room led me to believe, based on the statements, that someone had remained in the home long after police arrived that morning. So the question was for me, how the heck did they get out with all those people there in the house that morning? For more, you're going to have to read the book. Okay, so that's kind of the process that I went through for the writing process, the publishing process, and I'm going to show you some things if you don't have questions about the writing process, things that have not been seen by the general public. It'll only take a few minutes, but I wanted you to get an understanding of how I went about analyzing evidence that pointed to an intruder, and how one by one those things were disassembled. Yes, Scott?
I do have one question. I was just curious. Your previous writings were fiction, and this is a work of nonfiction. And I was just wondering, how, as a writer, how is that a different experience for you?
Well, it's, you know, I've written police reports for 35 years, so it kind of comes naturally, I think, in some regards. You're always trying to write objectively without inserting opinions. You present facts and information and let someone else draw the conclusions. And so in that regard, I think it came fairly easily to me. I've always enjoyed fictional writing. You know, I think I mentioned earlier at the outset that besides the murder mystery stuff I was working on, I wrote 3 full feature-length screenplays over the last 6 years. One of them was after the last screenwriters conference you guys held here a couple years ago. I went home that Sunday with a germination of a seed planted with some conversations with the people that weekend and wrote a Telluride murder mystery. That is probably going to be my next writing project, is I'm going to adapt that screenplay to a fictional account and publish that and market that around. It delves back into Butch Cassidy's gold bank robbery. So it's kind of a contemporary murder mix with some, you know, Western history here in Telluride. So look for that next project, maybe next year. But so it kind of came naturally both ways.
In your writing, I noticed that sometimes there's almost a prose that comes out. Now, I got to assume that that's not something that you included in your police report over your professional career. Was that, do you agree with that? Or?
I don't know if that's just come from creative writing classes that I've attended in the past, or just, you know, my style of writing. I couldn't tell you for certain.
Well, I really like that.
Well, thanks.
It brings, I mean, you're getting these facts, and then suddenly there's this other thing that's going around there that gives you more of a, it's almost like an insight into your psyche or something.
I wanted, when I wrote this, I wanted people to understand where I was coming from, the steps I took to investigate, which was a pretty complicated murder investigation. There was tons of documents, tons of evidence, tons of statements, and all kinds of different opinions and theories about who's involved. You know, besides the 2 primary theories that we'll talk about here shortly. But it really was a journey of discovery for me. I set out to understand the case so I could evaluate any new leads coming in to determine if they had any merit or not. And then uncovering things, discovering new things, finding things that other investigators had already unearthed and shared with people. It really was an interesting process, and I felt like it was my responsibility, if I was going to write about this, to share those experiences with other people and allow them to kind of make the same discoveries as I did and ask the same questions that I asked. You know, what's the significance of this? You know, now that we've determined this isn't true or this is true, whatever the case might be. So I like to think that you're right there with me exploring this evidence and then asking your own questions. Maybe I haven't asked enough to draw you in and get you interested in finding out what you think the final outcome should be. All right. Any other questions about the writing process? All right. Before I jump to the next slides, the 2 train of thoughts were that because Patsy Ramsey could not be excluded as the author of the ransom note that was left in the home that day, no one has ever been able to exclude her. Some people identified her as being the written author, both the mechanics of writing as well as the linguistics, the the language, the phraseology. And then the intruder theorists who believed it was a sexual predator who had targeted her and or the family for some type of purpose. The evidence that people pointed to that they believed accounted for a perpetrator was a boot print in the wine cellar downstairs where JonBenet's body was found. If you remember, there was a high-tech boot print from the poon of a boot left in some kind of like white fragile mold in the cellar there. It was not uniquely identifiable because there were not any wear patterns on it. It's just the standard imprint on a high-tech boot that could have been on any boot. There was a scuff mark on the wall beneath the train room window well, which Lou Smith believed had been left by someone either climbing in or out of that window. There was a suitcase beneath the window that was thought to have been either used to climb in or climb out, because the window was about, if I remember, about 4 feet off the floor, so you couldn't easily get up into it. I can't remember the exact dimensions at the moment. And then Lou believed that a stun gun had been used. And he compared pictures of where we knew a stun gun had been used in a homicide that took place in 1993 in Steamboat Springs. Gerald Boggs had been murdered by his wife and a male accomplice, and they admitted after they'd been charged of using a stun gun to torture him. They'd shot him, they'd beat him with a shovel as well. And there were marks on Gerald's face that looked similar to some markings on JonBenet's face. And he used some pictures from that autopsy on Gerald to try to compare the injuries on JonBenet's face. There was on the cheek kind of a deteriorated, almost the size of a button mark that distinctly looked like a burn mark on Gerald Boggs, and confirmation because that was the location where they'd used the stun gun on him. JonBenet had a similar mark here. A forensic pathologist in Detroit disagreed. He didn't think it was a burn mark from a stun gun, that he thought it was some type of imprint plus decomposition. There was another smaller mark on the cheek that, I'm sorry, I'm putting the wrong side, but it was too hard to line those up to determine whether or not they measured with a stun gun. There were a couple other marks on her back, however, that were easily identified and easily measured. And they were on her kind of the lower left back here, by about right in here. And they were about a little over 3 centimeters apart. And there were 2 distinct red abrasions. And that's how Dr. Meyer, the coroner who performed the autopsy in Boulder, described them as abrasions versus burn marks. So Lou went out with some of the other investigators and started testing stun guns to see if they could find a match for those marks. He thought that a stun gun would have been brought to the scene by a perpetrator to subdue and render control of JonBenet, and that the family wouldn't have needed a stun gun if they were going to murder their daughter. So that was one key component, according to him, is that the stun gun was used, it had to be a perpetrator, because no stun gun was found. Well, they tested a bunch of different guns. They anesthetized a pig or some pigs, and did test marks and measured them. When I looked at the investigation, I could not find any one-to-one comparative photographs for any of the stun guns to JonBenet's injury. And I asked that be done. And I'll show you some pictures here shortly. But I first wanted to look at the point of entry. John Ramsey had indicated everything was locked that night. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere else in the house. And John Ramsey had broken into the home earlier that summer when he had locked himself out. He had climbed through a rear garden-level basement grate that dropped into the train room in the basement, broke a window, and never repaired it. The glass was cleaned up, but it was never repaired. He talked about stripping down to his underwear and his dress shoes and climbing through so he didn't mess up his clothes. It's a very narrow, confined window grate, not easily observed from the rear of the house, the rear alley of the house. But that's how he broke in. And it seemed likely to me, based on his report and the height of the window in order to try to get into that basement, that he could have very well created that scuff mark as he climbed into the basement earlier that summer. So that was one piece of evidence that I thought was possibly explainable. That didn't necessarily point to an intruder being involved. The other was the Poon print, the high-tech boot print. Interviews with some of Burke's friends, one indicated that Burke had a pair of high-tech boots. They had some type of special thing on the laces. And Burke was a resident of the home. Unfortunately, they never located a set of boots, but had been told that they thought he owned a pair. One of the FBI agents who was there that day, who'd been at Boulder PD that morning consulting with the office, out of the Denver office, responded to the house after JonBenet was found, and with Sergeant Larry Mason of the Boulder Police Department inspected the wine cellar. How I became aware of this was that during my conversations with one of the sergeants in the investigative unit there at Boulder, he had pictures of Polaroid pictures of boots. And he told me that these are boots that they collected from people, and one of them was a set from the FBI supervising agent who was there at the scene that day, and they were high-tech boots. So that offered another possible explanation for that boot print there. It didn't necessarily have to belong to an intruder, because you had someone there on scene who could have been responsible for that as they inspected the scene of the recovery of the body. And then I turned my attention towards the train room window well, because that's where Lou was suggesting was the best place for someone to come in. There'd been a lot of discussion that I recalled in the media about some stringer spiderweb lines that attached the metal grate to the cement foundation wall and some of the foliage around that would not have been able to survive an entry through that grate if someone had come through that way that day. Unfortunately, no one took any pictures of those stringer lines, and it was reported that when the Boulder PD spoke to entomologists about the type of spider that web that would have created those, that they would have been hibernating that time of year in December, and even if they had been broken, they likely would not have been recreated. So there's a lot of discussion that I remember about that at the time. So when I finally got to look at some of the crime scene photos, these were some of the things that raised red flags for me. I don't have a long shot view, but this is the window grate here, which is near kind of the kitchen and the back door to the den and rear hallway. It's behind a barbecue, which is off to your right. And it's a fairly narrow spot, but Lou was thinking that this is a great place for a burglar to come through and use this in his presentations to suggest that this was the point of entry. When I looked at these crime scene photos that were taken concurrent with the time of the investigation of the processing the crime scene, there were pine needles on the top of the grate, there were some leaves, there was foliage underneath, and he pointed to foliage underneath the grate thinking that it had recently been raised and lowered over the foliage. But my thought was, and other Boulder detectives mentioned the same thing, was that they thought and realized in their inspection of this was that there were places where the foundation did not rise up and meet flush with the grate. So it was very possible for vegetation to grow underneath. And my thought was, if that's the case, plus as well as the other stuff, the debris that's on there, it didn't look like it had been disturbed in quite some period of time. And it didn't seem likely that that really was a point of entry. He talked about smudging on the windowsill. This is the grate removed. And this is a bank of 3 windows that sit along this train room window well. And there was another picture, which I haven't put in this presentation, that showed much fresher disturbance marks on another bathroom window that was a basement bathroom window. I can't remember if I put that in the book or not, but This looked like old disturbance to me that possibly was created when John Ramsey went through the window previously, and not necessarily fresh from someone entering on December 26th. So finally, after looking at these 35 millimeter photos, I finally had an opportunity to look at some crime scene video. And let me show you this. Are we okay, Ryan?
Yep.
So we just looked at those two. So the next thing I wanted to look at was the stun gun. And so I looked at the experimental contacts that they'd made with the anesthetized pigs. They had come up with a stun gun as the air taser being the most likely brand, given the measurements there. And as Lou has always said, follow the evidence. If you've got a stun gun, then it has to be an intruder, because the family wouldn't need it. And I go into some depth in one of the chapters about evaluating the use of a stun gun, but you know, it doesn't knock you unconscious. It's very painful, and most people scream their lips off when they get tased with one of those things. So I'm not quite sure if someone who knows what they're doing would want to try to use that on a 6-year-old girl who would probably scream uncontrollably if it was ever used on it. So I asked that some one-to-one pictures be compared. These are the injuries on JonBenet's back. Again, I'm not showing you the entire out view, but that gives you an idea of the measured. This is the air taser stun gun that they thought was the weapon used in the kidnapping. The contacts that would be required to make those marks don't align with the injuries on JonBenet's back. You can see the electronic probes there, the kind of the copper-colored pieces as they line up there. Was a stun gun used to create those abrasions, which is what Dr. Meyer described them to be during the autopsy, not burn marks? When I was preparing, I had not put together a written document for the DA's office after I left the DA's office in March of 2006. I'd put together about an 8-hour PowerPoint presentation, and I indicated that I would do the written part of it to kind of explain the PowerPoint, because you just can't always get away with a PowerPoint to really fully develop your theory and explain things. So the summer got busy. We had a busy festival summer, and it wasn't until after John Mark Carr was arrested I decided I needed to get my tail end in gear and write the written document to accompany the PowerPoint that I'd provided. I showed Harry Stevens some of the videos here that we just looked at, and who was a retired sergeant with the department at the time. And a couple months later, he wanted to send me something. He said, hey, I think I might have an idea that what could have caused those marks on JonBenet. So 2 heads are always better than one, I think. You always work with a partner when you're working cases. So this is what Harry sent me. It's a piece of O-gauge train track that usually has 3 pins in it. We've taken out the center pin here for demonstration purposes. This is the same type of train on the floor as well as on that table in the train room downstairs we just saw a video of. There was loose pieces of this type of track in Burke's bedroom as well, in crime scene video. I asked Boulder PD to put together a one-to-one comparison after I received this, and this was their one-to-one. Much closer match than the close match that was described for the stun gun. And then your actual comparisons there. Oops. How do I get that to run, Ryan? That video. This is a video. Hit that. This is I can't get this to run, but this is a video clip of how if you twist and jab that piece of train track, how it can leave marks and abrasions. These injuries were sustained by JonBenet when she was still alive. Otherwise, they wouldn't be showing up as abrasions in red. So they were, she was poked or jabbed or something caused those injuries before she was actually suffocated. And my thought is that this is a toy readily available there in the home that may have possibly been involved with the infliction of those injuries. If that's the case, who inflicted those, why, and where do we go from there? So those are some of the things that I looked at when I was trying to evaluate the evidence of an intruder and new discoveries that were made over the course of my involvement in the investigation. I outline a lot of those things, a lot more things in the book. It's there for your reading enjoyment. Hopefully it answers a lot of questions that have been developed over the years that would help provide clarity to perhaps how this happened. It's my feeling that it's very unlikely that an intruder was involved. If we follow the evidence, and I haven't even talked about the DNA evidence, you would have to be looking potentially at 6 different people being involved in this crime if you're going to rely solely on artifacts of DNA that was found on the implements used in JonBenet's murder as well as on her body and clothing. So it's laid out for you to make a decision on who you think was involved and how you think it may have taken place. But it's out there for you to decide on your own.
You want us to solve the problem?
Do I want you to solve the problem? So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for joining.